Welcome to this session in the evening. I actually won't directly address the question which has been set to me, quite simply because scientists should recognize their limitations just as we recognize our limitations in other areas of inquiry, such as the humanities and so forth. So, we basically don't talk the same language. So I'm not particularly interested or worried about what someone like Stephen Hawking may or may not say. What I want to say is something about what we should think about philosophy, why we should actually be interested in philosophy even before we get to the question of philosophy in the Islamic traditions, and something about how philosophy to a certain extent has been instrumentalized in the modern Islamic tradition for very important reasons, and then come back to a more older existing notion of philosophy, which I think we do need to recover, which represents a much more holistic approach to how we understand reality and how that reality binds us and ties us to the transcendent and to the noumenal. So starting off with, why we should be interested in philosophy. Of course, I would say that everyone should be interested in philosophy, because if we go back to someone like Plato, if we're not engaging with an examination of who we are, where we came from, where we're going, then it kind of begs the question of why we bother claiming to be human. The other day I said, if you don't read, you're not human. Now I'm kind of saying, if you don't do philosophy, you're not human. So deliberate provocation, and it'll be interesting to see how, people might want to come back to me at that. But fundamentally, there are a number of aspects of how we might understand philosophy as a particular type of inquiry, which I think are absolutely essential to how we live and how we understand the reality that we live. First of all is the nature of a critical examination of where we are, who we are, and linked to that, how that critical examination will inform the way in which we read texts. I've said this before, reading texts is partly about how we make sense of revelation, such as scripture, but also about how we read the world around us, how we read each other. We do this all the time. In basic communication, when we are speaking to each other, there's this constant process of evaluation, which is sometimes not very conscious, but in which we interpret what people say. So, people say certain things to us, and we understand what that means, perhaps at a straightforwardly linguistic level, but we understand from what they say and how they say it and how they pose it, and perhaps through their body language, a whole set of other things as well. And philosophy actually provides a number of tools which allow us to make sense of how we might read that. Alongside that, regardless of what people like Hawking think, the European intellectual tradition, and there is absolutely no doubt about that, going back at least to Plato, if not to Aristotle, well, certainly to Aristotle, privileges philosophy as the supreme form of inquiry. There are various types of sciences and inquiry which are out there. Philosophy is the supreme one, quite simply because it's through philosophy engaging with an examination of existence as it is that we are provided with the tools and the subjects that we use in the inquiry of pretty much all other sciences, whether those are sort of physical or exact sciences, whether those are things like ethics and so forth. Aristotle's very keen to emphasize this, and this notion of philosophy as the apex of a particular hierarchy of sciences is something that was very much embraced by the Islamic traditions as well. But the two other elements which I think are very important about why we should be interested in philosophy, and I haven't actually, of course, given you a definition yet, I'm going to come to definitions later. One is that, and I indicated this in our discussion, panel discussion yesterday, is that philosophy to a certain extent can provide us with the sorts of arguments, perhaps even questions, which can constitute a consolation of faith. Faith, as I was trying to suggest, is not straightforwardly rational, but there's no reason, in a sense, why one might not produce rational arguments for why one should have faith. And in this sense, philosophy then provides certain ways of corroborating and consoling individuals who may already have certain views or beliefs or faith or practices for all sorts of reasons, and it acts as a reinforcement for that. And this is precisely where I would place some of the classical proofs for the existence of God in this category. They're consolations, fundamentally they're consolations. And this is, again, very much within the philosophical tradition. A classic example is Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, which he wrote basically in prison when he was having sort of an existential crisis of faith, and he wrote a work which was trying to express and work out in detail philosophical arguments for the existence of God, Scripture, and so forth. And this was a way of perhaps keeping him sane, or certainly keeping him rooted in these difficult times. And we see lots of examples of this in the Islamic tradition as well. And associated with this is another reason why we might be interested in philosophy, which is directly associated with this, which is this notion that philosophy can be a handmaiden to theology. Again, very well known in the European scholastic tradition, where if you wanted to make sense of theological truths about the nature of God, about how God interacts with humans, how humans reciprocate, then you utilize the tools that philosophical inquiry and categories provide for you. Now, having said all that, and there are a number of other, I think, senses in which you could take philosophy, I just want to say a few things about how philosophy has been promoted, particularly in a seminary Hawzak context, which I think is quite significant. And the classical figure, of course, is Allama Tabatabai, and his two works, Bidayat al-Hikmah, Nihayat al-Hikmah, and also his Usul al-Falsafa wa Ravish al-Realism, which are all products of this period from roughly the 50s to the 70s, where he was producing his major work. And if you look at those structures, the structures of those texts, you really see what he's trying to do. He is basically, and he says this in a famous account which has been repeated again and again, about how he, when he first moved to Qom back in 46, he started teaching a circle of students philosophy. And the reason why he thought it was essential to study philosophy, and also, actually interestingly, why he thought exegesis was important, was because in this period, immediate period after the Second World War, there were lots of intellectual challenges out there. And these were challenges which were being posed in Iran, in Iraq, and various other places. And there were challenges coming from atheism, from different types of materialism, from different types of skepticism. And he felt that what the seminary students needed more than, say, the study of hadith or the study of usul al-fiqh or whatever, was a firm philosophical grounding which could allow them to formulate arguments in defense of their faith. And this was absolutely essential. So he says this when he's reflecting on what happened when he moved to Qom in 46. And you see this then expressed in his texts. So his texts are concerned with a number of things which will then reinforce or refute elements of the intellectual challenges which were present, to the seminary with a goal to establishing both that God exists and also that humans have a relationship of reciprocation to God. So, for example, if we take three classic challenges, one, say, is skepticism, that perhaps we cannot really know anything. One, which is materialism, that there is nothing in existence beyond that which is material. And of course, if you say that, then it raises the whole sort of question about, well, what might the nature of the soul be? And of course, what might God be? If everything is material, either God is also material or God does not exist significantly. And the third type of problem that he was dealing with was whether a skepticism about whether anything exists external to the human, which I guess you might call the problem of metaphysical realism. And so he tries to counter these three types of intellectual challenges, which are very much present and primarily were expressed through different types of Marxist thought in the post-war period. And he presents them, as I said, both in Bidayat al-Hikmah and Nihayat al-Hikmah, and he discusses them in this circle, which was then published by Mursa Mutahari as Usul al-Falsafa. And he does this in a number of ways. The skepticism is responded to by saying, well, actually, we can know certain types of things, and those types of knowledge, which I'll say perhaps a bit more about tomorrow, have to be rooted in a basic innate notion that we are self-aware and we have self-knowledge. So everything then arises out of the self and moves forward. Secondly, that there has to be much more than the purely material, because of the ways in which we might deal with issues around human experiences, how we might deal with issues around the nature of consciousness, how we might deal with issues around ethical evaluations of issues around justice, around goodness, around evil, and so forth. And of course, we can say that to a certain extent, that the idea that materialism in itself is insufficient is increasingly, things are turning around even in philosophy, where we might have said that in an earlier generation, materialism was becoming quite dominant, at the very least since the 70s, with significant articles such as Tom Nagel's What Does It Mean to Be a Bat?, which actually is quite a cool title for an article. It's a very important article. Really suggests why it is not good enough to look at the human experience and what it means to be human purely in terms of what is material. Because ultimately, with the examination of any type of organism, you need to really make sense of what it means for one to see the perspective of that particular organism, and it's much more than just the physicality of that. Now, as I said, you find these types of responses happening or taking place within Allama Tabatabai work, and sometimes it's said that compared to some other tendencies, even among some of his students, his work tends to be a bit more dry. And I guess his work is a bit more dry quite simply because of the sort of challenges he's facing and the conceptions of philosophy which are working. So, if you're faced with philosophers who are basically saying, look, it's nonsense to talk about a notion of existence, we can't really be sure about whether we can know anything, really philosophy has to be about the analysis of language and not much else, then your response is going to be very much in that particular type of vein, very precise, very clipped, very Avicennan in a sense. But I think we're now in this period where that sort of response, to a certain extent, is not good enough. And we do actually have other works of his which I think are far more interesting, such as the Risalat al-Walaya and others, which try to take us in slightly different directions. And they do this by really kind of bringing us back to, I think, far older, and ultimately I think some of these are pre-Islamic, at least in the kind of historical sense of what we might mean by Islam, notions of what philosophy is really about. And central to this is this notion, which I'm quite keen on, which is philosophy as a particular way of life, and philosophy as an inquiry which is geared towards acquiring wisdom, and acquiring wisdom is associated with becoming godlike. It's absolutely central to the Platonic tradition, and I would argue it's absolutely central to the later Islamic tradition as well, because it sees this recovery of wisdom as being essential to something which is revealed. It's prophetic. It's hikmah, wisdom, in the Quranic sense of khair kathir. It's something which is given, provided by God. It's then transmitted from prophetic lines. And in the handout I give you a particular type of genealogy of philosophy, which becomes very much standard in the Islamic tradition, of how philosophy basically starts with Seth, Sheath, and goes all the way through to the Greeks, and then in effect returns to the Muslims later. It has a prophetic origin, and it comes back to the prophetic tradition. So it's something which is not just I guess what you might call a secular or a neutral engagement, but it's rather an understanding of reality which is deeply sacred or sacralized. And so in that sense, doing philosophy, understanding reality, engaging in demonstrations about the nature of reality, is directly related to certain types of exegesis, whether it's of the Quran or whether it's of prophetic and imamic sayings. And again, I would argue that one of the best examples of this is someone like Mullah Sadr. So let me just deal a bit more with the question of godlikeness before I move on to this definition of philosophy and wisdom. So the locus classicus of what it means to do philosophy as a way of becoming like God is Plato's Theaetetus. I've given you the passage here. And this is of necessity, it is mortal nature in our vicinity that are haunted by evils, and that is why we should also try to escape from here to there as quickly as we can. To escape is to become like God insofar as is possible, and to become like God is to become just and holy together with wisdom. So the idea is that we're kind of imprisoned in this world of vicissitudes and evils, and we need to flee from it. And fleeing from it is partly about understanding where we fit in with this world and what the ultimate reality of this world is. And that fleeing from is moving towards God as a sanctuary, which I mentioned in my first talk, the idea of the sanctuary of God. And once we move towards God, we're moving towards justice and holiness and wisdom. These are sort of ultimate virtues which are associated with the divine. And of course, this is very much related to a mystical or practical mystical tradition, which would argue that a key aspect of wisdom or acquiring or being on the path of wisdom is to, as the famous saying or exhortation is, تَخَلُّقُوا بِأَخْلَاقِ اللَّهِ, acquire the virtues of the divine, acquire the virtues of God. And of course there are various ways in which you acquire it. You acquire them. You move towards God. You move through the mediation of the divine names, invocation of the divine names, contemplation of the names, contemplation, of course, on the reality of the Imams as divine names and so forth. But also to recognize that this moving towards and to become godlike has certain limitations insofar as it is humanly possible, because our very human form then has certain limitations within that. I've given you another quotation which is from Alcunius's Didaskalios, which is a very important late antique handbook of what philosophy is, and it begins with this expression of the goal of philosophy, this notion that we attain a likeness to the divine. And this attainment of likeness is much more than just a certain type of contemplation. It's not just an internal reflection upon who we are and where we are, but actually requires certain types of ritual practice, certain types of ceremonies, certain types of what I would call spiritual practices, which are absolutely essential. And those spiritual practices, I would argue, are not necessarily divorced from the standard ritual practices that one might find in religion. And this is something that certainly the late antique philosophers understood well. Was that an indication that I'm almost up? No? Okay. You should know better. So, coming on to the question of how we define philosophy. And I'll give you a quick definition, which is again from my chap, Mullah Sadwa. Incidentally, just because I talk a lot about Mullah Sadwa doesn't mean that I think he's perfect, and it's certainly not wahi, and you should never ever think anyone is infallible when they're not. And you should always take with a barrel of salt anything that anyone says, including what I say to you. So be critical. If anything, if an engagement with philosophy tells you anything, it is precisely that you have to be critical with what people say to you or what you read. Do it. It's basically, it's a wonderful rule of thumb. Expect people to have good intentions, but expect them often to be wrong as well. And that's perfectly fine. The definition that Mullah Sadwa gives is an important one, which kind of sums up what the entirety of the Islamic philosophical tradition is. And this is from his major work, Al-Hikmah al-Muta'aliya fil Asfar al-Aqliya al-Arba'a. And it's this, know that philosophy, the word here of course is hikmah, wisdom, is the perfecting of the human soul. Note the process, perfecting, istikmal. It kind of depends on how seriously you take a masdar in Arabic, but I take it fairly seriously to mean that we're talking about a process. A masdar, of course, is a verbal, well, at least can be translated as a verbal noun. Of the human soul, nafs al-insaniya, the human soul being the very bearer of our identity and who we are. And it's something which is in the constant process of flux and change and perfecting and becoming from our very inception. This is something that Mullah Sadwa has. He discusses how it is that we develop from being an embryo to our old age and even beyond. We're constantly changing. Even when we die, that process never ends. We're constantly developing and becoming, even in the afterlife. And then, of course, he would argue even assuming one attains paradise, one continues this process because it's in the very nature of human existence for this to be the case. And this perfecting is through cognition of realities of existence. So understanding what the nature of existence is, which goes back to Aristotle, as they truly are. So not just being deceived by appearances, but really kind of investigating what is the underlying reality of something. And through judgments made through demonstrations, classical Aristotelian syllogisms, forms of deduction, which are considered to be, which are considered to yield certainty. And that's the key thing, that through logical reasoning you achieve certainty and the truth about things. And these are not to be understood through conjecture, bizan, or through adherence to authority, bitaqleed. One of the things that Mullah Sad was very keen on, and I think it's kind of ironic that then people don't really take this seriously, is that he's really against taqleed of ideas. He's really against the notion that if you just hear from someone, or if you read from Ibn Sina or whatever, that this is the nature of something, or this is the argument, it's not good enough just for you to rehearse it, but rather you have to make sense of what that argument is for yourself. And you might actually find that you come up with a better version of it, or you come up with a version which makes more sense for you in your particular type of context. To the measure of human capacity, again noticing that there are certain elements of our embodied nature which will constitute limits of what one can do. There's elements of what it is that we are within this physical body that cause us to perhaps be shielded or constrained from understanding wider issues. You have a very extensive, mystical tradition of texts which argue, for example, that the body is a hijab. It's a hijab from true knowledge. It's an expression of our material attachment. It's an expression of our passions, our loves, our desires. And some of these, we think are perfectly normal, sort of a desire for love that we have for our family, for our friends, for our homes and so forth. But these are all things which actually potentially take you away from understanding your rootedness in a reality which is beyond that, which ultimately is about the relationship with God. And one, of course, thinks about this notion that comes up in the Quran a number of times, that it's precisely those sorts of attachments that we have which constitute trials and tribulations which afflict us, which we then have to kind of overcome. And the end of this, and I just realized I forgot to put the punchline in the quotation in the handout, is that by doing this you attain tashabbuh bil-bari, of similitude to the Creator. And what this means is that once one has that similitude to the Creator, I completely forgot the second paragraph, I do apologize, you can then ascribe a rational order to the universe. You kind of see how things fit in together. You see where you are, what your relationship is with the cosmos, and what then the relationship of those two features, the microcosm and the macrocosm, are with God as this kind of triangulated set of realities which are interconnected but ultimately come from God. So that's kind of the final end, is acquiring similitude to God, so that you can ascribe a rational order to things and understand how things fit together. Now, in other texts, he then Sadhguru makes it clearer how this constitutes a particular way of life, that this is not just a theoretical form of understanding. And I've given you one small quotation here, which is from his tafsir, and this is on if I remember correctly, it's the introduction, the khutbah to his tafsir on Surah Al-Waqi'ah, which actually is one of the more interesting sections of his tafsir, where he's talking about the perfection of the human. Again, I realize I've just written down man here. That's bad. It should be say human. The word is definitely insan. Insan does not mean man. Lies in the perception of universal realities. And the idea is that if you understand universals, if you understand basic realities or categories which are constitutive of various types of individuals, then you can understand the particulars which follow from that. And a disposition to understanding things in the way God understands them, divine cognition, and understanding that there is something, or there are phenomena realities which transcend material things that we sense, and that there is a process of self-purification from the restraints of carnal and passionate appetites. That again is about the kind of locating where we are as embodied individuals, and then trying to overcome some of those attachments, or at least to understand where they fit. And he says that this can only be acquired through, and this fourfold thing, I think I mentioned it the other day as well, comes up again and again, that these forms of perfection are acquired through guidance, through teaching, through discipline, and the formation of righteous character. And this is precisely this notion that you do need teachers who can guide you along these sorts of understanding. And they sometimes, the teacher does this through an aphoretic process, or perhaps a Socratic process. So the best way in which you learn things is if I kind of fire questions, like I point to you and say, tell me what philosophy is, or tell me what the soul is, or what is the concept of a category, what is a concept, and then I force you to really think through, and we have a sort of a debate, dialectical discussion about it. That's clearly the best way that people understand things. Unfortunately, at times, one wonders whether that happens in education anymore. But certainly this idea that it's more important to know how to ask questions, and perhaps to ask the right sorts of questions, which is key. To guidance and teaching. Discipline, and here we mean disciplining both the body and the soul. This comes back to this notion of spiritual practices as an essential part of philosophy as a way of life. And the formation of righteous character, that this notion of philosophy as a way of life is about inculcating a type of ethics. It's about what sort of person you are. So it's not good enough for you to be simply an individual who has a wonderful understanding of metaphysics, but frankly you're kind of a serial killer and I guess some sort of casual thief of some sort, and you abuse your friends and family or whatever. There's this kind of I guess cognitive dissonance and practical dissonance just doesn't work. So the formation of righteous characters is important. Philosophy as a way of life is partly then about a sort of a therapy of the soul, if you will. It's a way in which when you think about underlying realities, when you rehearse and then try and critically engage with arguments, you're dealing with a way of curing certain types of ills within your soul, and the most important ill within your soul, of course, is ignorance. It's not knowing things, it's not knowing how to do things, it's the fundamental vice actually is ignorance. There's absolutely no doubt about that, and that's something we see, for example, when you look at Usul al-Kafi, where we start off with the kitab of aql and jahl, of intellect, understanding, and of ignorance. But also that once you have trained yourself in this particular way, once you have attached yourself, rooted yourself to the divine, once you've understood that ritual practice is of significance, then by doing these things you actually do become a better type of person. There's kind of an inculcation which you missed the one in the middle at, where you realize that it kind of makes you a better person insofar as you become perhaps a bit more relaxed about things. The better you understand things, sometimes you're less worried about things. Ignorance is fear, as they say. You tend to fear things which you just don't know anything about. The more you know, the less you're fearful of what might happen. And in that sense, this philosophy as a way of life, and this is kind of the punchline, is also philosophy as a way of death. Because ultimately, living well is also about dying well. And by that I mean the death of the body. I don't mean the death of the individual, because of course we don't die with the body, but rather we persist beyond that. So part of it is this kind of ascesis, as it's called, the practice of philosophy as a way of life, as an ethics, which is then also, to a certain extent, geared towards dying well. So what I'm saying is, forget Stephen Hawking. It's kind of a waste of time to even engage with that stuff. What's more interesting is to think about what sort of resources do we have in the Islamic philosophical traditions which actually do speak to us. I mean, we have here a model of how philosophy works, which is deeply ethical, which actually does have very practical implications for the notion of, we're all concerned with good living and good dying. I've actually written this, another thing which if you're interested, I can give you a reference. I wrote a piece on the good death a while ago, which I gave in an interfaith context, which kind of freaked people out, because most people are scared of death. And my point is, well, actually, a good philosopher should never be scared of death, and certainly a good Shi'i should, rush towards death in a certain sense, not in a bad kind of Daeshi way, but kind of in a positive sense that death is a release towards true life, and I really should stop there. So, thank you for listening.